Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Miss Sara. Sara, how are you?
Hi, Nick. I'm glad it's another short week. I'm getting used to them.
And we've also got Mr. Hermann Pretorius.
Well, I've instinctually got the opposite reaction to Sara, because any short week, I'm just going, it's the 1970s. We're heading towards the 3-day work week in the UK. The bodies are going to go unburied. But in my scenario, Margaret Thatcher swans in with a handbag and all is saved.
We have 6-day weeks.
May it be so. Anyway, so I hope all of you have enjoyed your April Fools today. I'm sure you've come across some great April Fool's stories. There's one on the Daily Friend about Elon Musk, which you should check out, which is a lot of fun. But we shall be free of April Fool's jokes here in this podcast today, because we just didn't have time to make any good ones.
Oh, anyway, no, you're absolutely wrong. You're absolutely wrong. Everything we talk about.
I suppose
suited to April Fool's.
It's things are absurd enough already that it doesn't really make a difference
exactly.
when we talk about serious things or make up stuff.
The problem with being in politics in South Africa and April Fools is you can never know when it's real or not. It's like wokeism that's gone beyond parody. That it's really difficult to tell these days whether this is a parody or that it's genuine. It's like that one Wakesa guy or whoever responded to France's Business Day live letter defending Adam Habib, and you just read his stuff and it's like a parody of critical race theorist thinking. So it might be April Fool's Day every day in South Africa. Just celebrate that, cherish it,
embrace it.
Indeed so. And perhaps appropriately, today coming into effect is a new piece of legislation which has been passed and now it is being enforced, and that is the Political Party Funding Act, which has come into effect. This is an act which is seeking to regulate more closely the way that political parties manage their finances and their donations. There are fines imposed and sanctions imposed for violating the thing, which the IEC will be in charge of administering, that being the Independent Electoral Commission. Some of the most important regulations under the Act are all donors have to be declared to the IEC. All donors over 100,000 Rand have to be publicly declared to the IEC, which the IEC will publish on a quarterly basis. So that means if you give 10 Rand to a political party, you will the IEC will have a record of it. No one is allowed to give more than 15 million Rand. No individual or corporation may donate annually to any individual party more than 15 million Rand. The IEC will give a report to Parliament with a full record of the donations. There will be a multi-party democracy fund, which anyone who doesn't want to give to a specific political party but wants to contribute to multi-party democracy will give money to that, and then the IEC will decide how that money is allocated. Also, there are strong restrictions on any foreign entity giving money to political parties. I think foreign governments or agencies can only give money to, not foreign governments, but foreign entities can only give money for the purposes of skills development. Also, okay, let's just stop there. Hermann, a lot of people have made the argument, that there's that this has been especially a topic overseas, that there's dark money flowing around the electoral landscape, and this means that you can't see who's behind who and who's controlling what. What do you think will be the practical effect for South African politics if every single political party has to reveal all its large donors?
Well, I mean, we were talking about this before we came on air, is the administrative burden it likely places, and the bureaucratic burden it likely places on many parties is a real risk. These are, entities with limited resources to start with, and it's a bit like BEE, compliance things. I mean, I think, Anthea Jeffrey in a book, BE Helping or Hurting, estimated that it's, between 1.2 trillion and 2 trillion rand that has been spent by companies trying to be compliant with BEE regulations and stuff like that. So there's a massive cost to bringing your organization or your entity in line with new bureaucratic standards proposed by law. So that's one massive risk, is that this will just be a drain on resources for opposition parties that cannot siphon from the public funds the necessary funding that they can get to do what they need to do. So that's the one problem. The other problem is Look, I have a massive amount of debt that I'm still working off in terms of my study. So I'm by no stretch of the imagination someone with accumulated capital, and I probably never will be. But I do feel uncomfortable when states start telling people how much money they can spend on the promotion of their ideas. And this might sound like an extreme and irresponsible, typically American position, but I do think that there is this connection between speech and money. If saying that you cannot, that you can only spend so much on campaigning is essentially saying you can only spend so much money on speech, on promoting ideas. And if you take it all the way through its philosophical and elements, you come down to the point where the government is essentially limiting the time available to people to make arguments in public. Because if the government takes a quarter of my income, that means 1 week per month I work for the government, because they get a quarter of the hours I work every month. So 40 hours a month at least, I am an employee of the state, technically. So my time is not my time. The state owns my time for those 40 hours. And if you take it all the way to then seeing income and funding and money as what people did with their time, and the state then starting to intervene on that, the state is essentially starting to tell people how much time they are allowed to spend thinking about or working on or talking about political ideas. So there's a very, very dangerous connection between speech and funding and being able to promote the battle of ideas that I just don't like. It sits uncomfortably with me. That said, I do think there's dark money and stuff like that, but it's this constant trade-off of liberties. Like, do you make the rule restrictive so that the bad things can't happen, or do you make the rule expansive so that enough good things can happen to outweigh the bad things? And this whole approach just sits uncomfortably with me.
So, Sara, one of the complaints that some opposition parties have, particularly the DA, is that this will reduce the number of donations to them because people will be afraid of retribution. Currently, a lot of the political parties are very, very protective of the names of the people who give them money. And the argument goes that if opposition parties have to declare who their donors are, then the state will be able to start punishing them, because every time a business comes up for review as to whether it's going to get government contracts or government business in some way, the ruling party can just see if they gave any money to the opposition and say, oh, well, oops, sorry, you don't qualify for this contract. Do you think that's a realistic fear?
I think look, in South Africa, it's certainly a realistic fear in the sense that, the ANC is the government. So the government, I mean, they've certainly exerted power over the corporate sector, or the threat of power over the corporate sector on other issues. I think we've seen it most clearly recently with the NHI, or implicitly with the NHI. But what sort of really intrigues me about this is that there are two elements. There's one thing to publicizing or make public your donations or where they're coming from, but there's another thing altogether about then putting rules in place as to how much you can have and who you can get it from and why. I mean, there should not necessarily, there's no reason to put any limit on who can get what from whom. It's certainly, I don't see the legislation as having any effect on the way that, for example, the ANC may get money through Chancellor House, which wouldn't comply with anything related to donations or necessarily overseas entities or anything else. So I don't think it deals with the potential crookery, and I also think it's to my mind, what on earth is the IEC dealing with how it limiting or not limiting income? The issue is who gives the income. I think the question about individuals not being uncomfortable is real, particularly obviously at the higher levels, because so many individuals, wealth individuals or companies, donate money to the ANC and to they sort of hedge their bets with other parties. I think it's mostly detrimental to the small parties. It doesn't really make a difference to the ANC. I think the ANC could breach it probably with little effect, because again, by the time a lot of this becomes apparent, a particular election will have come and gone. The other thing, of course, when you talk about the bureaucracy for the parties, is there's another element to bureaucracy. First of all, I don't think the ANC could handle the bureaucracy. And secondly, I don't think the IEC could handle the bureaucracy of administering all of this. It's just, it's nonsense. I mean, it really is nonsense. As I say, I think it's more a case of it's not actually anyone's business how people get, how political parties get their money. It's the only thing that's our business is that they don't get it from corrupt, dark, theft type sources, and I think that could be dealt with differently.
Right. So someone could look at this piece of legislation and say, the ANC, there's provisions in it. For example, you can't receive money as a political party from a state-owned enterprise, which is something I think we all agree with. It should obviously be the case. But I think the idea that this is going to be equally applied to all parties is kind of laughable. I suspect it will be used as a political tool to destroy the enemies of the government.
Yes.
The ANC will probably, I have very little doubt there will be some parts of the ANC that will probably end up flouting this law and will not be prosecuted for it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It just, this plays into one of my frustrations with the South African Constitution. Now, I will fight a lot for the Constitution. Is it a flawless document? No. Is it a good document? It's good enough. It's not perfect, but no Constitution ever is. But it's bloody good. It's got some good elements, and it makes freedoms certainly more powerfully entrenched than they ever were in South Africa under nonsense like parliamentary sovereignty, which is a whole discussion in and of itself. But one of the frustrations I have with the Constitution is the Chapter 9 institutions. It sort of breaks the whole idea that the voter is responsible for appointing the state, because essentially what this act does is it gives policing powers to a Chapter 9 institution that, had the police and basic investigatory frameworks and the justice system just operated properly, all the dark money, the corruption, the bribery, all those things would have been policed. They would have been subject to scrutiny. But Chapter 9 institutions, as we see, all of them, perhaps with a possible exception of the Auditor General, all of them indemnify the voter against their own decision. Because if you vote for a party in South Africa, and you say you need the public protector, then what you're telling me is that you voted for a government that you don't believe can protect the public.
Exactly.
That's the first point. The second point is the IEC. Yes, I do understand it has a purpose, but it's got far too much power because it currently is in this position of already becoming politicized. If the public protector can go from Thuli Madonsela to Busisiwe Mkhwebane, clear factional political tool usage, then the IEC is not exempt from that. The problem with Chapter 9 institutions is that you give them state power, you give them government power, but they are not accountable to the voter as they should be. So Chapter 9 institutions as a broad thing sits uncomfortably with me because it indemnifies the voter against their own decisions or lack of participation. That's the point I'm trying.
Yeah, essentially, if that happens, the voter should be able to vote the party out of power.
Yes, and it also is, it's so infantilizing of the South African electorate in a way to say that, you can't understand the complexities of your decision, therefore you need all these other entities. And also this law is saying you are so manipulatable that we need to cap the amount of information that can reach you so that your poor tiny little brain doesn't overheat. There's this fundamental misunderstanding in marketing and in public communications that more money means effective communication. We should know better than any other generation or period of time before us. Virality. I mean, cat videos go viral with no budget. The idea that the notion that an idea can only spread with money behind it is nonsense. And then secondly, the idea that the notion that money behind an idea will make that idea powerful and catch on is also nonsense. So this whole law is based on this infantilization, the nannying of the South African mind.
Well, let's put it this way. If I can just comment on the spending money. The ANC couldn't buy the bad publicity it's had over the last while.
Exactly. Also, looking overseas, very often political parties that are not as well funded win elections. A recent famous example, of course, being Donald Trump in 2016, who had a lot of money, but he was had far less money than his opponent, and yet he managed to win a victory. And that story repeats all over the world all the time.
I'm currently reading Albert Grindeling's biography of Frederik van Zyl-Slabbert. It's brilliant. People should really read it. It's excellent. And Albert is an excellent historian and a brilliant writer. And in the 47 election, and the 74 election was really the election that turned it around for the Liberal Party. They went from 1 seat in Parliament to
the Progressive Federal Party.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. The Liberal small L party, the Progs
of the time.
Of the time. And for 12 years, I think Helen Suzman was the only parliamentarian of this party of liberalism in the South African Parliament, because you had the Union Party that was ironically named because it was fractured beyond belief, and it really was a useless party, and then you had the Nats. And for 12 years, only Helen Suzman was this voice for liberalism. And then in the 74 election, they had this influx. It was a good moment for them. If this act had been in place then, they would not have been able to compete because they would only have been allocated the funding of 1 seat. This is such a self-fulfilling nonsense that the more you have, the more you get. That is such a dangerous idea, because the basic rules of investment apply to this over a longer term makes it impossible for smaller parties representing dissonant voices, but important voices, to gain the representation that they really deserve.
Right. So I think the upshot here is money doesn't. It's not a be all or end all, but it is important to a certain degree. You need to reach a certain threshold to, I think, compete. So anyway, this is a story we're definitely going to have to keep covering, because we'll see its effects, I think, going into the local government elections later this year. And, of course, the national government elections in 2024. Assuming we have local government elections this year, because I see the EFF is once again calling for their postponement until 2024, which I don't think that's going to happen, but if it does, would be a very serious blow to the South African democracy.
Because if it does, constitutionally, something massive is broken. Because let's be very clear, there will be a need for constitutional amendment for the election not to happen.
Which they could do.
If
the ANC agreed with the EFF, there would be enough votes in Parliament.
Yes, and if they do that, then the fact that we have this act is the least of our problems.
Indeed. Anyway, let us move on to our next story for today, which is the subject of wage increases. The National Union of Mineworkers is concluding its National Collective Bargaining Conference, or just concluded it, and has resolved to demand salary increases of, on average, between 15 and 20%. There's also some other larger increases I think they're demanding. So the union is now soon going to actually begin commencing wage negotiations in both the gold and energy sectors, and aims to close what it calls the wage gap. Their acting general secretary, William Mbapa, said they will be negotiating for a 15% increase at Eskom. If we get a 15% increase, he said, we will sign a 3-year deal. But if we don't get 15%, we will consider a 1-year deal so that we can be able to strike every year. So their long-term goal is a 15,000 Rand minimum wage in gold and energy sectors by 2024. Let me go to you first, Sara. Can Eskom afford a 15% salary increase for its employees?
I would suggest that the thing it can afford would be to retrench about 20,000 people. And no, of course it can't. Look, I think the companies that can afford increases of any consequence are in the mining sector, and not uniformly, but presumably gold and platinum would have done reasonably well this year. But in the environment we're in, both politically, in terms of what the optics look like, and the fact that however well they've done, the world I think is just too uncertain for the next few years during and post COVID, that while those companies might be prepared to give a reasonable an inflation or slightly above inflation increase, there is no way they could commit themselves to 3 years unless they can very craftily build in a set of circumstances that see the 15% withdrawn if certain things then happen. I can't see them at this stage committing to anything like that, because the uncertainties of particularly of how this country is going to do economically are just too stark. They can, I don't know what they're going to do with Eskom, because of course Eskom can't afford to pay 0.0001% of an increase. And the problem is that unlike, the things are not uniform just because they're all in the same broad sector. I mean, generally speaking, the level of wage pay, the wages in a place like Eskom are high compared to the equivalent sort of job categories in the private sector. So I think we would all go ballistic if we saw them get pretty much anything, because it's almost ludicrous. And I think they're going to be problems there. And I think it's going to force management to take their eye off the ball. Although at the end of the day, I don't think the unions are going to benefit at all. But when they should be concentrating on just keeping my one light bulb burning, they'll be having fights with the unions, as is pretty much an annual thing. So I think what's happening is the ANC's philosophy of creating one industry, one union, one industry in 1994-5-6 is coming back to bite them, because of course the unions are not strong, the industries are in terrible shapes. It's a recipe for disaster for the majority of employee-employer relations, while you've got smaller, usually representing greater skilled unions sort of hiding in the background. Sometimes they'll attach onto and sometimes they won't. It depends on how they see the circumstances and how they see what's happened in the past bargaining years. So I think they could get something, but I don't think they could get it uniformly. And if they do, we would be entitled, as both people working in the private sector who are not getting increases and taxpayers are paying a hell of a lot of money for getting nothing, would feel about it.
Right. I stand under correction, but I believe that if you have a 15,000 Rand wage, you're in sort of the top 40%, top third of South African households.
Correct.
So if that's the minimum wage that NUM is asking for, they're basically arguing in the South African context for a massive pay increase for quote unquote the rich or the upper class. It really brings value to that term labor aristocracy, which I know
which of course we know that by and large miners, while they earn a reasonable wage, they usually have huge numbers of people dependent on them, and right. The costs and the obligations they face are huge. So one certainly understands the social pressure.
That's because unemployment is so high.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, exactly. And it's not going to get better in a very long time.
I must say, if I want to just say two things on this. Is firstly, I'm disappointed that they're only asking for a 15% rise. I mean, why not take a chance and go for 150% raise? I mean, why not just shoot for the stars. I mean, you're working for an entity that's 460 billion rand in debt. You're asking for more money. Why limit yourself to double digits? Really, just where's your ambition, NUM? I'm disappointed in you. It's a bit like.
Hold on. It may help, Hermann, if I clarify some of their reasoning. Mbapa said at the conference that their delegates resolved that if Eskom can afford to procure energy from independent power producers at a higher cost than it sells energy for, it should be able to afford their salary increase demands.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes complete sense because
I can see the problem is they can't actually afford to pay for anything they're paying for.
Yes, no. Sorry, I mean you're trying to complicate this with like Western racism and white supremacy. If you can't afford expensive stuff, that means you can afford cheaper 15% wage rises. I mean, it just follows logically. I do see the jump. It's like the connection between pushing a virgin into a volcano and rain. It's just, it's there. So that's the one thing I want to make. And the other point I want to make is that were I ever in corporate South Africa, I was ever confronted by a union, my wage negotiations would be very, very simple. I'm probably precluding myself from engaging in these negotiations in future because I'm laying out my plan here. Number one, I would give in to any demand for any wage increase for the following three things in return. Number one, secret ballots independently managed for strike action. Two, in future, raises will come from shares of profits. And three, employees will receive shares in the company as part of their pay package and as part of their pension fund scheme. Because the real problem here is, and that's why the Thatcher Labour changes was, I mean, she did a lot of stuff, but the one thing that she really did and that led to almost 45% of union members voting Conservative in the 83 and 87 elections was she understood that it's not your average worker who is the problem here. It's your union boss, it's your fat cats who want to make political hay and want to be loudmouths. Really, if you want to control this situation, if you want to control strikes in South Africa, make it secret ballots, because the workers understand that if I'm going to demand my employer out of existence, I'm demanding myself out of a job. The labor unions don't have to worry about that. The fat cats don't have to worry about that. They're not paid by these companies and their financial viability. So those three things: secret ballots for strikes, shares of profits for raises, and then as part of a payment package, shares in the company. Do that and you actually get the workers to have skin in the game, and you pick a finger for the union bosses.
Can I just say that theoretically that's fine, and I know I was involved in talks that had some relation to that years ago. But the problem, of course, is you have that sort of very, very strong union taking the membership with them divide, particularly with the COSATU unions that are ideologically driven by the socialist dream that will result in everyone having nothing, essentially. But it's the absolute divide that ensures that sort of that keeps that from happening. Ideally, that is what you want to happen, because you need to see wage increases go with productivity increase, whatever the motivation is, or whatever the company is offering, and that's what I mean about the problem of the emphasis in the bargaining situation of one union, one industry, is that you have usually one massive union, COSATU union, and all the others are smaller if they exist at all. And this is why what happened during the Marikana era was so key, was that situation swapped around, where you had a big union who was in opposition, who became the big union in AMCU. So yeah, ideally we should, but that actually means union members would have to be prepared to make the break. And right. I think that's one of the biggest problems.
And that probably can't happen until the police are better able to protect union members from threats of violence, because there's so much violence currently in the way that labor relations are conducted in South Africa. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening, and we will be back with you next week for another episode of the Daily Friend Show. We hope that you have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next week. Cheers, everyone.